Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. The last time you saw us, we were reflecting on The Blue Beautiful World by Karen Lord. And as promised, we have Karen, who we'll be interviewing and having a chat with today. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it is our pleasure. So, throughout our discussions, there was sort of a recurring theme where we realized there were quite a few mentions of Africa, the African diaspora. So,
Mhm.
do you consider your work Afrofuturistic?
Now, that's a good question because some of the genre labels I think are more marketing labels, and I have to admit that when it comes to these things, I trust academics a bit more to tell me where my work is cited. When you're writing something, especially if you're not necessarily concerned about the boundaries, you are not always going to be neatly within a particular category. One of the things I think about Afrofuturism, which I don't want to be quoted on because I'm not an academic in this particular area, is that I think it sits more with African American writers. That's where you get your almost like aspirational Black futuristic society, and it's very much within the mold of that kind of background. What I do and what some of my colleagues do, we call that Caribbean futurism because the Caribbean is more than Afro-descended people. It's more than the specific history that is known by African Americans. It's a very complex thing. So if I'm to be kind of honoring, indigenous people, if I'm to be honoring various people who've come from various corners of the world to this region, I can't just call it Afrofuturistic. It is very much of a more kind of blended, very Caribbean, very much kind of sited in the region, not necessarily locationally, but culturally and in terms of the outlook, shall we say. I hope that answers your question.
It definitely does, and it opens my perspective even more. Francine?
Mhm.
And on that note, it leads really well into my question, which is, as you said, it's Caribbean futurism. How would you address, however, complaints, if any, that your work is not Caribbean centered in the sense of many of the books that we review here at Page Turners Plus, of course, we focus on Caribbean lit, whether
Mhm.
it's by Caribbean authors or set in the Caribbean, but there's you can identify the Caribbeanness of the majority of the books that we
Mhm.
have reflected on. How would you address someone saying that your work, in particular, The Blue Beautiful World, it doesn't
Mhm.
feel Caribbean in the way that a lot of other Caribbean literature books would feel very Caribbean?
Um, that's a question that sometimes has a range of response. Sometimes I get it doesn't feel Caribbean from someone who is not of this region.
Mm,
And I can almost understand that because they've been primed to think if it hasn't got calypso, if it hasn't got beaches, if it hasn't got, all the trappings of tourism, then you can't call it a Caribbean book. And I do
mm,
try to push back against that because, in this region, we are going to work, don't see the beach for a while. We are Facebook, we are all the rest of it. We can't just be what the tourism industry is sort of putting forward as the face of the world. So that's one aspect. But then the other aspect is we do have a lot of Caribbean literature that is physically located in a Caribbean territory. And a lot of my work is not. When you look at Redemption and Indigo and Unraveling, those are two books that are set in regions that are more based on the Caribbean, but it's a fantasy world.
mm,
And similarly, for The Blue Beautiful World, now The Blue Beautiful World, although it mostly takes place on Earth, it's the third book in the series where the first two books do not take place on Earth, where they take place on different planets, which are, yes, I'll confess, made up. The star systems they're part of are not invented; they're real, but the planets are made up. The civilizations are made up, of course, unless aliens came when I wasn't looking. And so I'm coming from that very broad, almost galactic view down to the global view. And I mentioned some Caribbean territories, but the Caribbeanness of my work for me has to be in the values that I'm talking about, the interests that I have, the concerns that I have. To give just one small example, I do center the Pacific Ocean and Pacific Islanders a bit more in this book than I would the Caribbean islands. But part of the reason for that is we've had for a very long time in Barbados and in the region concerns about islands that are facing loss due to sea level rise, that are facing stress due to climate change. So there's an element of all small islands are in this together
Right.
that makes me feel as if, you know, I can almost like extend my sense of belonging, not just for the Caribbean islands, but also for other islands and other oceans elsewhere. Um, and and I want the versatility. My colleagues, some of them are writing from Caribbean diaspora locations, and that's where their stories are cited. Some of them are writing, again, either made up future worlds or made up fantasy worlds, which may have, you know, like one or two Caribbean characters that we tend to slip them in almost like Easter eggs because we don't expect the Western readers to necessarily understand that. And I mean, I made a point of putting rum into the Galaxy game. That's the second book in this series. But the way I described it, it's not called rum, and that's a kind of the whole like jokes that we make to ourselves as we kind of write these things, which seem very, you know, anybody can read it and it's not necessarily of any place, but we've actually seeded it with all these little nods and little comments that when you're a West Indian, you look and you're like, ah, yes, I know what that is. Oh, sorry,
Just
one more thing. I
okay.
should point out that my short fiction is more likely to be set in a Caribbean island
Okay.
because I've written a new Panama, which is actually set partly in a future Barbados and a future Panama, Costa Rica area. I've written with Tobias Bukel, we co-wrote a novelette called The Mighty Slinger, which is about calypso band in space that basically has a generational task to literally advocate for laborers' rights. And I've also written a more recent Barbados location story. Sorry, not recent in terms of when I wrote it, recent in terms of when it's placed, like more near future than far future, where it looks at us expanding our landmass, you know, artificial islands, bridges, sea bridges, and connecting the region in ways that, you know, technology of that time, some future time might be able to do. So if you really want like cited in the Caribbean stuff, you need to look a bit more of my short fiction.
I I just wanted to add the you chose Havana as one of the locations, a significant location in the
Mm-hmm.
novel. Is there any
Mm-hmm.
particular reason for that?
Ooh. There were several reasons, and sometimes I don't have good reasons for doing things, but I will give them to you nevertheless. Cuba is a place I haven't been to yet. So the Havana you see, there's not a Havana of experience, which is almost me being angry about that. But at the same time, there's an element of, you know, in our region, we've always maintained our connection to Cuba, insisted that we're not like freezing them out, they're not embargoed from our point of view, and so on. So it's almost my making a comment that in the same way that I relocated a whole lot of like UN bodies from European countries to African cities and other Asian cities and so forth, I was also making a point. We're going to have something really crucial happen in Havana, just to let you know that it's not on the outside of the world. It's not marginalized. It's not failed. It's nothing like that. Something is happening there that is actually really important, and the US has nothing to do with it.
Excellent. These are some of the reasons I thought that you used Havana. So it's good to hear that.
I'm going to ask kind of a more basic question, actually. It was really exciting to come across your novel and to read a ostensibly Caribbean novel, which was futuristic, which was science fiction. I can't remember the last time. Actually, I can. That's not true. I probably read Nalo Hopkinson the last time I read some
Yes.
science fiction. Could you tell us a little bit about how you made that choice as a novelist from the Caribbean to choose that genre and what it offers, you think, Caribbean writing?
Okay, so this is where I admit that my entire background is not at all typical of most Caribbean writers. I do not come from an English literature background in terms of my actual studies. I come from a science background. So as a reader, I was steeped in science fiction and fantasy already. And as a student, I was in the science stream. When I did my undergrad, I did major in physics, a minor in astronomy, and my specialist was a history of science and technology. So that is really the ground on which I stand whenever I'm looking at story. That's why you'll see me being interested in things like, how is space travel going to work? How does this happen? However many years from now, so on and so forth. Because these are all questions that I've been looking at as a reader in the books I've chosen before, and also as an academic, in things that I was learning about and things that I was researching. And I know that when I come into interviews sometimes and it's like Dr. Karen Lord, I have to say, okay, this is not a doctor in literature. My doctorate is actually, it's a sort of a sociology-based literature, but it's actually theology and religious studies. I say sociology-based because my PhD involved a lot of number crunching and statistics, which a lot of people don't think about. It looked at religiosity in non-religious settings, and involved the use of questionnaires and so on. So I don't know Hebrew, and I am not going to argue for the Bible and all that sort of thing. But it is definitely not a literature degree. It is a degree that has helped me a lot, especially when you look at the Blue Beautiful World. I will say to you precisely that where you see them put in the importance, making music so important, making sports science so important, that's literally my PhD. Because I looked at music students, sports science students, and compared their attitude, their approach, their feelings towards their subject to religious feelings, people's feelings towards their church, their faith, and all that sort of thing. So the idea that you can have that same amount of transcendence and community bonding and identity when it comes to music, when it comes to sports, all of that in there is indeed stuff I've studied at the PhD level, but not literature.
So I wanted to take you back to something you mentioned in your answer to Francine, because I do love the political aspects of writing. So
Mm-hmm.
in the world of the novel, you appear to suggest that there's a gradual shifting of the balance of power away from the geopolitical north towards the geopolitical south. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this stood out immediately to me, and I highlighted it immediately in the book. So
Mm-hmm.
why did you want to explore that idea?
I felt like I had to. It's like any science fiction book right now that is set into the near or mid future that does not have climate change as a background, I can't wrap my head around it. And similarly, any future science book which makes it seem as if the American Empire and the remnants of the British Empire are just going to keep going strong, I can't fully believe it. That's just not how history works. And we can talk about the aspirational aspects of, yes, Afrofuturism or Caribbean futurism or whatever you like, in the sense of this is what we're wishing for. But the reality still is, as I said in the book itself, empires will rise, empires will fall. There will be a shift. So you need to be able to show that shift in who is the dominant culture, who is in the center in terms of global politics and actually like getting things done. And also, and this is the important aspect of climate change, who is more stable. I believe that there are more African cities that have a chance at stability in terms of climate change by virtue of their location, or at least even if they're coastal, have a chance to move in a bit more. I spent a lot of time in my book in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is already facing so much danger in terms of it's very low lying, and it's already had to deal with drastic floods like from the 50s and so forth. So imagining sea level rise, if our polar caps melt completely, for example, what the Netherlands would do. I said to myself, well, this is not a country that is either it's not going to survive, or it's going to have to throw all of its weight behind just getting incredible sea walls and sea domes up. It's going to be almost like an underwater city. But I don't see it having the resources to do that and still stay geopolitically central. So you have to figure out where the energy is going to go. And of course, it's all speculative. That's why the genre is called speculative, and that's what makes it fun. But as I said, I want to see, and more or less, what's important to me is I want it mentioned casually, There are people who feel they can only do that in terms of, I'm going to center this in a novel. I'm going to make the novel all about, how it's, everything shifts to the geopolitical south and so on and so forth. But I feel there's a power in mentioning things casually because you are now the assumed mainstream. It's so ingrained in your background life that it doesn't even seem to be worth mentioning that much. It's like, oh well, here we are, and you keep going. I want that kind of casualness when we talk about new empires rising, when we talk about the Caribbean still having importance, all of those things.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated that. And when I read it, I sort of saw it as the global South having to clean up the mess of the of the North. But that was just my own interpretation. Uh,
Can I just ask, while we were on the subject, to kind of expand a little bit and ask, Karen, how do you define the difference between science and speculative fiction?
And back into marketing versus academic genres.
However,
So
which way you want to do it.
okay, I'll tell you what I thought, and I'll tell you what I've learned since then. I thought speculative fiction was just like an umbrella term for science fiction, fantasy, horror. Basically things that you don't see in sort of real life that are made up, and so you can have your magic, you can have an invented world, whatever, whatever. But then I realized that speculative fiction has a weird reputation of being seen as almost a bit snobbish. Like if you're a very literary writer and you don't want to be those commercial people who just like bang out Star Trek type novels, you will say you're a speculative fiction writer, and there's supposed to be an added cachet to that. But then sort of the internal politics of who is a real writer start coming into play, and I'm not part of that. I just want to be able to have a term I can use that will explain what I'm doing, that will explain it in a broader sense. I mentioned to you before that sometimes when you're writing, you're not concerned about the boundaries, you're not concerned about the exact lines. And I do find that in the Caribbean especially, we are so accustomed to using speculative elements in our literature. We're so accustomed to having a bit of magic here and a ghost there and whatever, and it's just seamlessly woven in. Now, of course, I'm carrying it a bit farther because I'm literally having this like 150 years in the future, or I'm literally putting this on an invented place that's not of this earth. But then, what does Poppy show? It's still and ultimately, there's a point at which I do say, let the agents and the publishers do what they have to do and call it science fiction. But I'm always back to the academics. What are the academics saying about my work? Are they finding something in it to analyze, to assess? Are they finding literary merit in it? Are they finding, the strong Caribbean references that the other readers in the West might be overlooking? And they give me hope. They give me hope because they do find those things. And I just sometimes think to myself, maybe it's not about how my book is classified now or how the genre is classified now, but what is it going to look like 50 years from now with this book? A lot of our marketing kind of sort of pressures are guided by what sells now and what Hollywood is signaling, and the Marvel universe and DC universe and all the rest of it. And it's just easier to signal to the reader, oh, this is like this other thing you enjoyed, but it doesn't necessarily make it an accurate description.
Francine?
Okay, that was really interesting. Just before I get into my actual question, because I think and many books that we have discussed both in Page Turners, and the three of us are also members of the Caribbean Book Club, we always come up with this discussion about, is it magical realism or is it that's just Caribbean life?
I would
Because I
say the
know,
latter. I would say the
right,
latter.
because specifically I know that Kai Miller, his book August Town, people refer
Mm.
to it as magical realism, and he has said
Mhm.
himself, no, it's not
Mhm.
magical realism.
Mhm.
That's just
Yeah.
life in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
That's just how
Yeah.
it is. So
Mhm.
it's interesting that you raised that point. But to carry on, um, we noticed there was heavy anti-colonialism in the novel, and that you drew heavily on planet Earth's experience with colonialism in telling this story. Can you talk us through that?
So I think I'm probably anti-colonialist in everything I write. That's a particular drum that I'm always beating, I'm afraid. But it also connects to the themes in the previous two books, where you do have a galaxy where there has been a level of working through what it means to be a colonizer, or to be in a kind of a senior position to another location, or perceived senior position to another location, by virtue of having longer established history or greater development or what have you. So a lot of those questions are being worked out in the first two books, so that by the time you get to Earth, you're almost saying, well, Earth is doing almost like a small scale type of colonialism, where it's sort of, inter-nation, interstate, inter-tribe, whatever you call it. But that's almost like small potatoes compared to what these planets, these star systems have been doing to each other. Everyone is human here, even the human beings that are not on Earth, even though we call them aliens, they're still human beings, and I've still given them the flaws and the dangers, I guess, of being human. And the idea that you always have to be in some kind of hierarchical position, whether it's as an individual or as a collective, is something that I struggle with personally, and I don't see as being beneficial overall. And I do wonder if we can get past that as individuals and as a people. And a lot of my work has been about, how do you get to a better place with that? How do you get to a point where, yes, we're a collective, but we are a cooperative group, we're a collaborative group. We're not, somebody is in charge and somebody else has to compromise all the time.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question that I think follows relatively neatly on from that one, because I do think one of the things I really loved about your book was the way that you were thinking about power,
Mm-hmm.
and taking this idea of tapping into power, or individuals tapping into their own power, but using it for good, like the possibility of power to actually be something that is a positive. When often novels, I think historically, and I'm not a literary scholar to make such statements, but I'm going to. I think whenever I've seen books discuss power, it's always been how power is terrible, and how power, absolute power is bad, and absolute power, power absolutely corrupts, blah, blah, those kind of things. Whereas you say, well, what if people use power for the greater good, and not in a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Not in a misdirected, misunderstood kind of way, but genuinely having carefully and coolly and calmly thought about, how we could together be better, support one another and collaborate, and do it on kind of galactic scale. What if we use power for good? Which I think is perhaps particularly interesting in the post-COVID moment, right? Where we saw when governments wanted to protect their people and when they weren't that bothered. How power could be wielded for good, or it could just be frittered away. And so there's a question in there. The question is sort of, we know that. Why are you so kind of, how do you come about constructing a world like that? Because it takes a bit of imagination in this present day and age. So to imagine it 150 years into the future in a whole different world, I think is a real feat. And it's also really hopeful. Was that important to you to create a possible world that we can't see, most of us now? There's the question.
So I like the word hopeful. People have indeed accused me of writing hopeful things. Before the pandemic, a lot of critics said it with a sneer. After the pandemic, a lot of critics said it with gladness, because I think the pandemic taught us that maybe hope is a thing that we really want to embrace, as opposed to assume that it can only be light and fluffy and like have no depth to it. So there is very much a hopeful strand, because my stories are always working out some problem. It's like, this is where we are now, but we don't want to be here. How do we get to a better place? When you said specifically about how you use power, we all have. Oh goodness! I'm trying not to bring in the other books too much, but I'm going to have to, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the protagonist in The Blue Beautiful World, whose name is Owen. His family is actually important to the whole sweep of things, because in The Best of All Possible Worlds, which is the first book, is the first time we see him as a teenager, as a young teen, And you learn in that moment that the power that you see him exercise later in the Blue Beautiful World, his father has it. His father has it, very strongly. Maybe not quite as strong as Owen is, but very strongly. But he's chosen to use it to control his family. So they're on a remote homesteading, and he's made his wife obedient and docile, and he's made his daughter quiet and and cute. No toddler tantrums, nothing like that. And there's this weird way in which that I've had this happen at book club before. There were some people who thought, well, he's not hurting them, he's not hitting them, he's not yelling at them or whatever. How can this be abuse? I said, you take away a person's ability to choose who they are and what they do. That there's no consent in that, once you've taken it away. So Owen, who's sort of name at that time is Rafi. Rafi is growing up under this shadow where he knows what his father is doing is wrong, but he can't get anybody to take the situation seriously because his father is too strong and can just like block off all attempts to make anything different. He does finally get out of the situation with the help of his aunt and his soon-to-be uncle. But you can see as he goes through the next book in the Galaxy game, as he grows a little older and so on, he's constantly wrestling with the fact that he has the same power and he can use it, as you say, for good or for evil. And which is he going to choose? What I hope I've shown in the Blue Beautiful World, and which is also a common thread going right through, is that whatever power you have, whether you use it or abuse it, sometimes doesn't come down to your own willpower, but comes down to the power you give to those around you to operate as the checks and balances for you. One of the things that Rafi does in the middle book is he purposely moves to society that has stronger psionic powers because they already have an established system of this is what's ethical to do with your power and this is what's not ethical. So that system doesn't exist in the planet he's from because most people are kind of like Earth and quite ordinary. But he knows if he goes somewhere else, there'll be somebody say to him, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. And then if you step out of the line, I have the power to stop you. So that's one thing he does that to give him a little bit more stability. But by the time you see him in the Blue Beautiful World, what I like about it and what I hope I've really put forward very strongly is that his aunt, his uncle, his colleagues, his adopted sister, his adopted mother, his friends, these are all people that they can call him on it, and he encourages them to do that. So now he almost has the freedom to try to do certain things. I don't think there's ever a suggestion that it might not also go horribly wrong. But the point is, he's not doing it just by himself, for himself. He has all these people from all these different corners who can say at any point, no, wait, you need to stop, you need to pause. Things are not going in a good direction. Have you really thought this through? And when you have that sense of security, when you have that full network of people who, whether or not they're as strong and powerful as you, can say something like, are you really considering this properly? Then I think that frees you up to use your power or your talents in ways that are ethical, in ways that are helpful. And, Rafi's power, Owen's power is a metaphor. There are plenty of people in our world right now who do have a particular talent, whether it's charisma, whether it's, a special intelligence in a particular field and whatever. And sometimes people don't even use what they have in our real world in an ethical way. And as I said, if you have that wider network, if you have the friends and the family and the colleagues who will say to you, no, stop, and you're willing to obey them when they say stop, then it frees you up to be able to think, okay, I can use this thing in a good way.
Thank you. I'm just going to say one more comment. It's not a question, it's a comment. But I think Francine mentioned earlier August Town, and one of the similarities listening to you there, I think that similarities in terms of theme is that when we read August Town collectively several years ago, it was one of the first books we read in the Caribbean Book Club, and it really struck me that I think Camilla expresses in that novel a certain skepticism of the power of the collective, and you almost do the opposite, I think, in this novel, which is that you express a profound belief in the goodness or the possibility of collective collaboration and the generative nature of the
Mhm.
collective. And so I think if anyone had that
Can
reference,
I can I address that? Can I address that? Because I hugely respect Kai, and I don't want to go up against him. But I'm gonna speculate a little bit about how he may have framed it and how I am framing it. The collective can be dangerous if it's small enough that it is simply self-reinforcing. What I try to point out with Owen's collective is that there are people from all over. He's got like family or connections on like 3 different planets that are not Earth even before he gets to Earth. So we're talking about people who are within their own collectives, but these are different points of view. He's able to triangulate. He's able to say, well, this person and this person are in completely different worlds, but if they're saying the same thing, maybe I have to listen to that. That's a little different from the scenario where, say, you're in your own small town, small village, workplace, whatever. Everybody's, yeah, go ahead, do the thing. And then it becomes more like, oh no, these are enablers. These are not people who are helping.
that's a really important distinction because I've clear to be clear, like we absolutely loved August Town, and still do love it as a novel. And so thank you. That's a really useful distinction, and we love Time Minutes. That's not a beef thing. It was just interesting that the two novels are kind of different.
I was kind of teasing about that, but yeah, I hugely
it's
respect
really
Kai.
interesting that you're taking the same theme and using it and with different sort of ideas behind it, because Kai's novel August Town is a novel of historical fiction. It starts it goes right back into the middle of the 18th, 19th century and goes up to the 1980s, and yours is 150 years into the future. So that in this massive time span, we're coming up with human beings struggling with these same ideas. I just thought was quite fascinating.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Francine, go ahead.
No, you're good. So I wanted to. I remember you mentioned that you did quite a lot of academic work on religion and religiosity. I think that was the word. So after the Patrona, the very tall leader of another planet, warns the citizens of Earth that they are aliens who plan to colonize the planet, religious riots in which tall people are targeted erupt in several countries. Was there anything in particular about this type of response that you wanted to invite your readers to think about? Um, and even your Caribbean readers, some of whom are very religious.
Now, I have to go back and check it in case I projected something I didn't mean to project. I think the fact that there were religious riots and the fact that tall people were being targeted was in the same paragraph, but they were slightly separate occurrences. Because the idea was just that xenophobia can be very easily awakened. So if you see someone who is alien telling you something, you're like, okay, in what ways are you alien? In what ways? What is the difference that I now have to internalize and know that I have to make my target because this person is not one of us? So that was the one thing. The religious riots were really just along the lines of every religion, almost every religion has its own sense of what the apocalypse should look like. So the whole idea of a civilization or civilizations coming from outside of our planet into our space is just completely upending to so many religions, philosophies, everything. So that was why I had to point out that there was a stir going on there. So I think there were 2 slightly separate occurrences, but the underlying reason is the same thing, which is you were given a framework which you was stable, that you understood, that you believed in, that made you feel comfortable about moving through the earth, and then it got completely turned over. How do you react? Some people react with a lot of fear and a lot of aggression, and that's the thing that has to be managed sometimes.
On a probably related note, I don't know, it depends on what your answer is going to be. There are entities in the novel that are known as mind ships. I feel like it's linked in a way to religion. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but can you explain to us what these mind ships are and their role in the story?
So it's not linked to religion, but you may see me get excited as I explain it. So every time I look at any kind of novel that is or work that is based in the future, in in space. The question you really do have to ask yourself is, how do people get from point A to point B? Because you only have an empire or a group of connecting countries or whatever, if there is actual physical movement between them, or at least some level of communication between them. Now, we always run up against the speed of light when it comes to imagining that thing in an outer space setting, galactic setting. So there's so many science fiction novels which have dealt creatively with the whole concept of how do we get faster than light communication, how do we get faster than light transportation, and it's only at that point that you can start to have a coherent galactic culture where everyone is more or less developing parallel to each other, each aware of what's happening with each other, as opposed to like having a gap of like several years or centuries. So the mind ships are about that. The mind ships were my idea of, okay, we're going to have transportation. We're going to do the interdimensional trick, slip into another dimension where you can travel faster and then pop out closer to your destination and travel at sublight speeds again until you reach the surface of the planet. That's the basic idea. But my concerns have been about, if you're going to be talking about going from, the present dimensions to other dimensions, what does this do to human consciousness? So I decided, instead of having a kind of a mechanical ship that people invented, that there was already a creature in the oceans of Sidera that had the capacity to slip into those dimensions, and that at some point they acquired a symbiotic relationship with humans, and instead of just moving from like one part of the ocean to the other, vast distances there, but still planetary ones, in seconds, they then transfer that ability into space. This was before I watched Discovery, where the tardigrades took over that, and I'm just like, darn, but I published mine first. But the concept is already there. I mean, even before earlier Star Trek had space whales, we've always had in our heads the idea that maybe there are these vast creatures that can, be in space in the same way that we have vast creatures in the ocean. There's a way in which a lot of spacefaring novels are imitating seafaring novels from the age of sail. There's a definite a correlation going on there. But with the mind ships, because I was about, how do we maintain human consciousness, at the point of departure to the point of destination, then I was able to play a little bit more of what it means to have a symbiotic relationship, what it means to preserve consciousness. When I wrote it, there are just various things I'm playing with. I note that there are some people who handle travel by mind ship better than others. Some people don't handle dimensional stuff at all unless they're fully knocked out. They can't do any level of consciousness. And then the thing you see in the Blue Beautiful World, which is fascinating. So Sidera had the mind ships, and they were really in control of, sort of interplanetary transportation in the galactic setting. But after their disaster, the Zenuvians, they're the ones who made their ships, but they had pilots kind of like plugged in. And again, that's an old trope. That's nothing I invented. Pilots sort of plugged in and doing what the mind ships do, but in more of a mechanical way. But then Nchune has been developing this thing with Raffi from the Galaxy game, and you can see a bit of it in Blue Beautiful World, where they're using other organic material and this thing which is based on the wall running game. And it's almost like it's a stationary thing, and it uses portals. So it's actually, the other ones you have to go off the surface of the planet and then go into the dimensions and then end up at another point above the surface of the planet. This one goes from surface to surface. And that, I warned you I was going to be geeky about this. And that really has ramifications for things like, warfare. In terms of being able to go directly to a surface of a planet, in terms of being able to, do biological warfare, drop a nuclear, weapon or anything like that. So there are all kinds of kind of possibilities all wrapped up in that. And so the mind ships is just like one aspect of this whole huge question of transportation, communication, And even though I finished this draft before the pandemic was fully in motion, I was still very conscious of, look at how, the COVID vaccine spread so quickly because we have such a huge flight network. We always have planes going from point A to point B. And there are ways in which, the checks and balances that you have at ports and airports can't contain it. That was literally the kind of situation I was imagining as a background for my series. So I was getting very excited about that, and yes, considering what are your transportation options, how do you have transportation, but also minimize the dangers of transportation, and also what if we had an organic way to do this, another creature, another entity, another sentient being that could do this in a way that was so to speak natural.
Keswa, we have time for one very brief question as our last one, so you could take it
No.
away.
Oh, thank you. What honor. Well, that's perfect. So I was going to ask about virtual reality because in your novel it features heavily, and there were lots of sections of it that I was just like astounded and confused, and I don't understand what's going on. And because the imagination and the science that you bring to it, I think, is incredible, and it's unlike anything I'd read before. To be quite honest, but that's not a bad thing. That means that I'm new to this fiction and this genre, and I'm keen to learn more. And so I thought for our readers, sorry, not readers, or fellow readers and viewers who also might be relatively new to Caribbean science fiction, speculative fiction, what would you recommend them to read? And would you, for those who are already excited and are going to be watching this, like knowing you and everything that's already happened, what are your hopes for the future of the genre? Or would you like to see what are the novels, the stories yet to be told? So there's kind of two questions in one, which is opposite of a small question. But Roger knows me. He didn't really expect a small question. He knew I was going to do that.
So some of the names that I can immediately mention in terms of who's been doing this much longer than I have, Nalo Hopkinson is definitely, occasionally I get a reviewer who has, an interviewer who hasn't done their homework asking me, how does it feel to be among the first Caribbean writers? I'm like, whoa, no, you really don't know what's going on. But Nalo Hopkinson, in terms of especially science fiction and fantasy, is someone who's been doing this for a very long time. But let's bear in mind, go back to Edgar Mittelholzer, My Bones and My Flute, Ghost Story. I did that at CXC. This is stuff I also grew up with. So you can have fun both looking at the contemporary Caribbean writers and also looking at some of the old school ones as well. Tobias Buckell, Grenadian-born writer, grew up in the Virgin Islands, and also Cadwell Turnbull, also Virgin Islands as well, I think, yes. Tiffany Yannick is not called a SF writer, but still uses, again, speculative elements in some of her work. We have, oh goodness, you see, I should have made a list in advance because I'm going to forget somebody and this is going to be bad. You already know about Leonie Ross. You already know about, you see, I'm going to start drifting into people who are not necessarily classically speculative fiction, as in they're not part of the Western concept of it and the Western tropes of it, but who I still feel use enough of speculative elements in their work that you really need to pay attention to what they're doing. Leonie Ross is definitely in that category for me.
That's a good list.
RSA Garcia.
I can save you if you want. I can say that's enough now. Stop. And so you can say she cut me off. I was going to say you next on this podcast. It was me. But what are your hopes for the genre? And just maybe say that last person whose name you were saying when I interrupted you. But also,
RSA Garcia is a Trinidadian writer, and she's been doing some amazing stuff as well. Yes.
Thank you. And the last question was hopes for the genre going forward. Like, what are the stories or the things that you hope to be tackled by up and coming people listening and thinking, I don't know what to do. I want to try my hand at this genre.
So Tobias Buckell has said something that I always use this as a quote. I always attribute it to him because I think it's so important. He said that if we don't imagine our own future, other people are going to imagine it for us. So if there's anything I feel about this genre as a genre, mind you, I'm kind of still genre agnostic. I still want people to just tell the story that they need to tell. And if speculative elements helps it, fantastic. If it doesn't, that's fine too. And you don't have to be one or the other. You can definitely be like You can do both. You can write a realist novel, you can write an SF novel, and have them both in your portfolio. So having said that, I think it's very important for us to imagine our own futures. And I also want us to seize the mainstream. That's my quote. You can attribute that one to me. Seize the mainstream. What do I mean by that? We have publishers, we have readers, we have reviewers whose concept of a diverse book is a book that so visibly and obviously centers some aspect which is on the margins of typical, white, Western, heterosexual, whatever life. That it becomes the story, that it becomes the driver of the plot and the shaper of the character and the everything and the everything. I once, without naming any names, Tobias and I once had reason to complain about a book where the writer was obviously trying really, really hard the diversity thing, but in the first few pages, the main characters, the protagonists, seemed so concerned within their own heads to determine exactly what color skin that they were, what shade skin they had. That I was like, does she think that we kind of go around like, contemplating precisely what color we are today? It just seems incredibly artificial and incredibly worrisome to me. I know part of it is because we've had situations in the past where they have been characters of color in books, and there are some Western readers who blow past entirely the descriptions and assume the character is white. So I do understand why some people feel like, no, I got to state this up front and center. But at the same time, you don't want to make it seem as if, people are moving through their space constantly preoccupied with their color, with their history, with their whatever. Some of us are just out to like have a good time and go to work and have fun, and then you are the one on the margin, the sort of the white Western, you're the one in the marginalized thing, the weird culture, the different things happening, the different expectations and so forth. So I do want people to seize the mainstream, to not always feel as if they have to cater for what they may see as a majority audience, and really just write the book that's comfortable to them. And sometimes that means pushing back against editors, which is not always easy. But anybody who tries to make you Caribbean up a book because they feel like it's not what they think tourism has told them it should be, resist that. Say, I am in my center. I am so in my center that you don't even realize I have centered my center.
Thank you very much, Karen. Unfortunately for our viewers, that's all the time we have. The next time you see us, we'll be reflecting on Donna Hammond's The House of Plain Truth, which is her new novel, which is being released the ending of January. But before we leave, we do have a treat from Karen Lord. She'll be reading for us from her novel, The Blue Beautiful World. Thank you for joining us.
This is a reading from The Blue Beautiful World, which is set 150 years in the future. And I'm taking us to have a look at Amsterdam and changes that have happened there since climate change. In Amsterdam, since the population collapsed in the 2070s, it was possible to book not merely a suite of rooms, but a plot of land, complete with environmentally appropriate, low-impact dwellings and offices, security points included, and bordered by a grid of canals in a moat-like manner that was both aesthetically pleasing and slightly isolating. The walk between the cabins was short, but uncomfortable. The Netherlands was suffering from a summer heat spike, and everyone was either staying in during the peak sun hours or huddling near the massive misting fans installed by civic administration along the banks of the canals. Tarek found the setup primitive, not because of its low level of technology, but because of the sense of too rapid change, evolution without consolidation. This city was no longer building on the foundations of an irretrievable past, but scrambling to keep ahead of the razor-sharp blade of a future that promised death to the unprepared. The climate had shifted. The design of older buildings was obsolete, and the city was trying to adapt with the ponderous speed of a battleship trying to change course. During his earlier travels, Tarek had seen a little of Amsterdam and a lot of the cities on other continents. Some places were more stable than others, but many of the once prosperous states of the Northern Hemisphere exuded desperation of various types and flavors. There was the desperation of a rich man in a mansion trying to enjoy the last of the party before the bill collectors broke down his door. There was the frantic virtue of a criminal turned monk, flagellating himself in vigorous but useless penance. Most of all, there was the manic optimism of incompetent politicians, assuring their public that the measures being employed were not at all too little and too late, and begging them not to erect the guillotines just yet. He knew his history, and this present had a familiar echo. Old empires were slowly falling, new orders were struggling to become established. Here, the new factor was the reach of it. This was not a single city to be sacked, burned, and left to crumble to ruin, nor a mere country decimated and taken over by wildflowers and beasts amid the lingering threat of live minefields and unspent chemical shells. This was the whole basket overturned, all the eggs smashed, all the hopes crushed. Humankind had lived for 2 centuries with the ability to self-immolate utterly and a tendency to play with matches. It was only a matter of time before they followed through on that somber promise. No malice aforethought needed. Something, error, neglect, or the unpredictable and unprecedented, might easily tip the balance against them. The entire planet was at a tipping point, ripe for salvation or destruction, angels of deliverance or barbarians. And in the meantime, bread and circuses made life bearable and occasionally diverting. And here comes the circus. Tarek understood what Owen was doing, though he was not sure that he fully approved of it.